The book of Exodus is one of the most influential texts in human history. It tells the story of an enslaved people rising up, escaping tyranny, and forging an identity under divine guidance. For countless generations, it has been read not just as mythology or literature, but as a record of actual history. Yet, when we compare the narrative to archaeology, to ancient records, and to what we know of the ancient Near East, the story quickly begins to unravel. The Exodus describes a population of hundreds of thousands leaving Egypt, wandering the desert for decades, and eventually settling in the land of Canaan. But the first problem in scale, if even a fraction of the numbers in the story were real, it would have left behind traced ruins of camps, human remains, broken tools, pottery fragments. Archaeologists have combed the Sinai desert for decades, yet the evidence is not there. A group that size would have left behind more than silence in the sand. Some defenders try to shrink the numbers, arguing the original Hebrew word might not mean thousands, but clans or families. Even with those reductions, though, the absence of evidence remains striking. Desert nomads always leave traces, and a migration on this scale at the supposed time leaves nothing. Egypt itself also kept extensive records. The ancient Egyptians were meticulous record keepers, documenting everything from tax collection to military campaigns. Yet in their inscriptions, papyri, and temple carvings, there is no reference to a mass slave population suddenly leaving, no record of plagues devastating the land, no king humiliated by an enslaved people, nothing. And while silence doesn't always mean an event never happened, the sheer absence in such a heavily documented society is telling. The pharaoh at the center of the story is left unnamed, which is unusual. Later traditions tried to identify him, often pointing to Ramses II, but Ramses' reign is one of the best documented in all of Egyptian history. We know about his military victories and defeats, his construction projects, even details about his family life. Yet there is no sign of a catastrophic series of plagues or the sudden loss of a massive labor force. His monuments still boast of Egyptian strength and stability. Then there's the matter of geography. The route described in Exodus includes cities and landmarks that either didn't exist yet or were misrepresented. For example, the store cities said to have been built by the Israelites include Pi-Ramesses, a city that only rose to prominence centuries after the supposed time of the Exodus. This suggests the story was written down much later, looking backward with anachronisms. Even the dramatic crossing of the Red Sea has problems. The Hebrew phrase used may have meant Sea of Reeds, referring to marshy wetlands near the Nile Delta. Over time, the translation shifted, and the miracle grew larger. But whether marsh or ocean, there is still no evidence of an entire army drowning or of a people mass migrating through that region. When we look at the broader historical context, the Exodus story begins to resemble other liberation myths of the ancient world. Stories of oppressed groups rising aided by gods are not unique to this text. What makes Exodus stand out is how central it became to later identity and belief systems. But mythic power is not the same as historical accuracy. What archaeology does tell us about the origins of the Israelites points in a very different direction. The earliest evidence of their culture doesn't show them arriving from Egypt at all. Instead, it shows them emerging gradually within Canaan itself from the same cultural background as their neighbors. The shift seems to have been less about migration and more about social transformation. Small groups of people in the highlands began to distinguish themselves, eventually forming the identity we now recognize. In this light, Exodus looks less like a literal chronicle and more like a foundational myth, a story written down to explain who these people were and to give them a powerful sense of purpose. Myths can shape reality, but they are not themselves reliable records of reality. The plagues themselves, described with so much drama, also raise questions. Rivers turning to blood, swarms of locusts, boils, and the death of every firstborn. If such events had happened at once, they would not only devastate Egypt, but ripple through trade, diplomacy, and neighboring societies. Yet again, silence. The records of surrounding cultures show no disruption of this kind. And when we examine the plagues individually, some appear to be exaggerated versions of natural events. The Nile sometimes runs red with algae blooms, but not in a way that wipes out life in the river. Locust swarms happen, but they don't strike at the command of a single figure and devastate only one land while sparing another. These echoes of natural disasters may have inspired parts of the tale, later magnified into cosmic scale signs of power. The story of Moses himself adds another layer. His infancy, placed in a basket and set afloat on a river, mirrors earlier Mesopotamian legends, such as the story of Sargon of Akkad. Such parallels suggest borrowing and adaptation rather than eyewitness biography. Taken together, the book of Exodus seems less like a history and more like a crafted epic, drawing from folklore, older myths, and political needs of the time. The question is not whether people told these stories, but why. What purpose did they serve? They may have offered a unifying narrative for a scattered population. They may have legitimized later struggles by grounding them in a grand tale of liberation. They may have provided moral lessons about resilience, identity, and hope. But history, in the strict sense, is absent. When we start asking why these stories were written the way they were, the historical inaccuracies themselves become clues. They show us that the authors were not simply recording memories, but crafting a narrative for a particular purpose. For example, by portraying Egypt as the cruel oppressor and Israel as the liberated people, the writers created a sharp contrast between their own identity and that of their former overlords. It's less about factual reporting and more about shaping a moral universe. This raises another issue. The book of Exodus depicts massive slave labor used to build Egyptian monuments. But historians and Egyptologists know that most monumental building projects were not carried out by slaves at all. Archaeological digs around pyramid sites and temples reveal workers' villages with evidence of food, housing, and healthcare. These workers were often peasants fulfilling a form of tax labor, not enslaved foreigners beaten into submission. The popular picture of Hebrew slaves toiling under the whip is simply not supported by the physical evidence. Even more telling is the silence of Israel's neighbors. The Canaanites, Moabites, Edomites, and others left inscriptions and artifacts that describe their interactions with Egypt. If there had been a sudden mass migration into their lands, it would have caused upheaval, conflict, and records of newcomers settling. Instead, what we find in the archaeology of Canaan is a gradual cultural continuity. Pottery styles, farming techniques, and settlement patterns evolve slowly, not suddenly. The timing also matters. Scholars who try to date the Exodus usually place it somewhere between the 13th and 15th centuries BCE, but both of these proposed windows run into problems. In the 15th century BCE, Canaan was firmly under Egyptian control. A large group fleeing Egypt only to settle in Canaan would essentially still be under Egyptian rule. By the 13th century, Egypt's control of Canaan was weakening, but again, there's no evidence of a massive influx of outsiders. Instead, the population growth in the highlands appears to come from within, from people already living there. This has led many scholars to suggest that the Exodus is not a memory of one big event, but a symbolic story woven together from smaller threads. Some groups may have had ancestors who did flee Egypt in small numbers. Others may have carried folk memories of oppression or escape. Over time, these fragments could have been stitched together into a single sweeping tale of national origin. The historical inaccuracies become more understandable if we see the story as myth-making rather than fact-telling. There's also the question of numbers. Exodus claims that around 600,000 men left Egypt, not counting women and children. That would make the total group easily 2 million or more. To put this in perspective, Egypt's total population at the time may not have even been that large. The logistics of feeding, moving, and housing such a group in a desert landscape strain belief, and again, the lack of archaeological remains makes the claim even harder to sustain. When defenders of the story try to reduce the numbers, they run into another problem. Even if we shrink the group down to tens of thousands or just a few thousand, it still leaves no archaeological footprint. At the scale described in the Bible, silence in the record is fatal to the claim. The 10 Commandments seen at Mount Sinai also raises questions. A group of former slaves in the desert suddenly receiving an advanced moral and legal code, but many of the commandments are not unique to Israel. Laws about theft, murder, and honoring agreements are found across the ancient Near East. The Code of Hammurabi, centuries earlier, contains striking similarities. This doesn't make the commandments meaningless, but it shows they were part of a broader cultural stream, not a singular revelation. When we read Exodus with modern historical eyes, its inaccuracies actually tell us more about the people who wrote it than about the events themselves. They show us what those people valued, feared, and hoped for. They wanted a story of deliverance, of divine justice, of being chosen and set apart. And they achieved that through narrative, even if the narrative was not grounded in history. There's also an ethical layer here. The story portrays Egypt suffering under devastating plagues, culminating in the death of every firstborn child. If taken literally, this would mean a mass killing of innocents, not just rulers or soldiers. That raises troubling questions about morality if one reads the story as real history, but if we see it as myth, the plagues become symbolic, exaggerated expressions of triumph, not actual events. This distinction matters, because if we mistake myth for history, we not only misread the past, we also import those distortions into the present. And for centuries, people have taken Exodus as literal truth, shaping identity, politics, and even justifying violence. Recognizing the historical inaccuracies helps free us from repeating those mistakes. When a story survives for thousands of years, even when it is historically inaccurate, it tells us something important. It tells us that accuracy wasn't the reason people kept repeating it. Instead, they found meaning, identity, and cohesion in the telling. That is what makes Exodus so fascinating. Its historical weaknesses are obvious when measured against archaeology, but its social and psychological power is undeniable. One way to understand this is to see Exodus as a kind of national charter myth. Many societies invent or exaggerate origin stories to bind people together. The Romans told of Romulus and Remus raised by a she-wolf. The Greeks told of divine heroes and epic wars. None of these tales were factual histories, but they served as anchors for cultural identity. Exodus, in the same way, gave a scattered group of tribes a shared past and a shared mission. What's especially interesting is how the inaccuracies themselves may have helped the story spread. The more dramatic the miracles, the more inspiring the tale became. A people might not rally around a dry account of slow cultural shifts in the highlands of Canaan, but they could rally around a dramatic tale of escaping a mighty empire, led by signs and wonders, guided by a lawgiver chosen by the divine. In that sense, exaggeration was not a flaw, it was a feature, and the story didn't remain fixed, it evolved as it was retold. When later generations look back, they reshape the tale to fit their own struggles. During times of foreign domination, the Exodus could be read as hope that oppression would not last. During times of internal division, it could be a reminder of a shared origin. In this way, the inaccuracies allowed flexibility. By not being tied to actual events, the myth could adapt. But myths are double-edged. On one side, they inspire resilience and unity. On the other, they can create rigid boundaries between us and them. The Exodus story defines identity by contrast. Israel is chosen, Egypt is cursed. And when such narratives are taken literally, they can justify exclusion, hostility, or superiority. This is one reason why examining the historical truth matters. Myths are powerful, but they become dangerous when mistaken for literal accounts. Another angle that is often overlooked is how Exodus reflects psychological needs. The human mind is wired for stories of liberation. We crave arcs where suffering is redeemed, where justice is restored, where the oppressed rise against impossible odds. The Exodus story satisfies that craving in a way that feels emotionally true, even when it is factually false. This may explain why it resonates so deeply across cultures and eras, even outside its original religious context. It also shows something about how people deal with trauma. If the early Israelite tribes had experienced periods of hardship under stronger powers, whether Egypt, Canaanite kings, or others, then retelling their past as a story of heroic escape gave them dignity. Historical accuracy was never the point. Emotional survival was, and myth-making became a tool for endurance. The problem, though, is when later generations treat the myth as a literal chronicle. Because once a symbolic story hardens into claimed history, it gains authority it was never meant to have. Exodus then becomes not just a tale, but a claim about the world, about morality, and about who deserves power. That is how inaccuracies in an ancient story can ripple into real-world consequences. We can see this in how the Exodus has been reused in politics. Groups throughout history have drawn inspiration from it, often without regard to whether it really happened. From revolutionaries to colonists, from enslaved people seeking freedom to nations seeking legitimacy, the story has been retold again and again as if it were a proven account of deliverance. But its historical foundation remains absent. The tension between mythic power and historical emptiness is what makes Exodus so revealing. It exposes how humans build meaning from stories, even at the expense of truth. It shows how a narrative can endure precisely because it bends, adapts, and ignores the strict boundaries of fact. When we compare Exodus to other liberation myths, the pattern becomes clearer. Take the Mesopotamian story of Sargon's birth, where the infant hero is placed in a basket and set afloat on a river. Centuries later, Moses is described in almost the same way. That parallel alone suggests that storytellers were not preserving eyewitness memory, but drawing from a shared pool of myths and reworking them to fit their own context. Or look at the theme of divine intervention in battles. The Exodus narrative portrays plagues, pillars of fire, and the drowning of enemies. These motifs echo other ancient tales where gods step in to tip the scales in favor of their chosen people. Such stories were never meant as journalism. They were expressions of hope, identity, and power in symbolic form. The archaeology of Canaan adds another layer to this. Excavations across the highlands where early Israelite settlements appear show no sudden break from the culture of their neighbors. Instead, the material culture, pottery, architecture, farming, looks like a continuation of what was already there. The picture that emerges is not one of invaders arriving from Egypt, but of local people gradually developing a new identity. The so-called conquest of Canaan looks far more like an internal evolution than an external invasion. Even dietary habits, revealed through animal bones left in ancient trash heaps, show this. In early Israelite sites, pig bones are strikingly absent, while they appear in neighboring settlements. This small but telling shift suggests that identity was being shaped through cultural boundaries, not through mass migration. Avoiding pigs became one way to say, we are not them. That kind of gradual differentiation leaves traces in the soil, while the grand Exodus story leaves none. The persistence of the Exodus story, despite this absence of evidence, reveals how myths gain authority. Once a story is written down, repeated, and ritualized, it starts to feel like truth. Each retelling adds weight until questioning it feels almost unthinkable within the community. Inaccuracies stop being problems and start being features of sacred memory. Over time, the line between story and history disappears. This is why Exodus has remained so central. Even though the evidence against it is overwhelming, it was not preserved because it was true, but because it was useful. It gave a people a past worth remembering, and that was enough. The human tendency to prefer a meaningful story over a messy reality ensured its survival. The irony is that the historical record tells a story that is, in its own way, just as fascinating. Instead of a dramatic escape from slavery, what we see is the slow rise of a new cultural identity from within the hills of Canaan. Instead of plagues and miracles, we see farmers and herders carving out a distinct way of life. That may lack the drama of seas parting, but it reveals the true processes of human history, adaptation, resilience, and the creation of meaning through everyday choices. Yet once Exodus was written, it overshadowed all of that. The inaccuracies froze into scripture, and the myth became more real than the archaeology ever could. This tells us something profound about how humans treat history. We don't just remember facts. We select, reshape, and sometimes invent. And once a story takes hold, it can dominate collective memory for millennia. This is why Examining the inaccuracies matters so much because when myths harden into unquestioned truth, they don't stay confined to the past. They shape the present. They influence politics, identity, and moral claims. And in the case of Exodus, the gap between myth and history is as wide as any in human storytelling. The influence of Exodus didn't stop in the ancient world. As centuries passed, new communities took hold of the story and reshaped it for their own purposes, and each retelling added new layers, sometimes stretching the historical core even further from reality. In the Persian period, when Jewish communities were living under foreign rule, Exodus was reread as reassurance. They weren't free in their own land, but the story reminded them that deliverance was possible. The inaccuracies of the original narrative weren't a problem. They made the story flexible enough to apply to new situations. Later, during the rise of Christianity, Exodus was reinterpreted again. The crossing of the sea became a symbol of baptism. The lamb's blood at Passover became a symbol of sacrifice. The story was no longer about a group of people leaving Egypt. It was transformed into allegory. But with each reinterpretation, the supposed history drifted even further from any archaeological grounding. What's striking is that the more the story was adapted, the more authoritative it became. By the time it shaped medieval Europe, Exodus wasn't treated as one myth among many. It was treated as sacred history, unquestionable and absolute. That status gave it a cultural power unmatched by other liberation myths, which remained in the realm of legend. Modern psychology helps explain why this happened. People are drawn to stories of suffering followed by redemption. Our brains remember narratives better than raw facts. A story like Exodus provides not only a past but also a template for the future. If liberation happened once, it can happen again. That psychological hook ensures that the story stays alive, even when evidence says otherwise. Cognitive science also shows how repetition cements belief. When a narrative is repeated in ritual, told year after year at festivals, sung in hymns, read aloud in households, it stops being questioned. Familiarity becomes a substitute for truth. Historical inaccuracies become invisible, swallowed up by the comfort of tradition. There's also the social dimension. Exodus was never just a story told in private. It was told in community. That communal reinforcement creates powerful pressure to accept it. To doubt it was to doubt the group itself. In this way, belief in the story became less about evidence and more about belonging. The inaccuracies were irrelevant next to the solidarity the story created. And yet, outside of those communities, the cracks are visible. Archaeology shows no mass migration. Egyptian records remain silent. Settlement patterns in Canaan contradict the narrative. Comparative mythology reveals borrowed motifs. Each piece of evidence pulls the story further into the realm of fiction, but perhaps the most revealing part is how Exodus became a story that others outside its original context borrowed. In colonial times, settlers described themselves as a new Israel, escaping oppression. In modern politics, liberation movements have used Exodus language to frame their struggles. The story's historical inaccuracies didn't stop it from being persuasive. If anything, its mythic nature made it more adaptable. This is the paradox. The less historically accurate a story is, the more flexible it becomes. Facts tie a narrative down. Myths allow it to float free, reshaped to fit new generations. That is why Exodus, despite its lack of evidence, continues to echo through history. Treating Exodus as literal history has always come with ethical consequences. The narrative portrays one group as chosen and another as cursed. If it's read symbolically, those contrasts can be softened, but if it's taken literally, the message is that some people are inherently favored while others are destined for ruin. That kind of thinking has justified exclusion, conquest, and even violence. The most troubling example is the final plague, the death of every firstborn in Egypt. If understood as historical fact, this is mass slaughter carried out not against armies or rulers, but against children. Generations of readers have tried to explain this away, but the moral weight remains. If someone believes this event really happened and was divinely sanctioned, then it normalizes the idea that innocent suffering can be part of a larger plan. That is not just historically inaccurate, it is ethically corrosive. There's also the issue of land. Exodus feeds into later claims that a particular people were destined to inherit a particular territory. That sense of entitlement, built on a story without evidence, has shaped centuries of conflict. Myths can inspire, but when mistaken for legal deeds to land, they ignite disputes that archaeology alone cannot settle. Ignoring the inaccuracies doesn't just misrepresent the past, it reshapes the present, and it makes critical thinking harder. If people are taught that Exodus is factual history, then they are being asked to suspend skepticism. They are being told to privilege tradition over evidence. That habit of mind can spill over into other areas, discouraging honest inquiry. Modern historical method offers a healthier way forward. Instead of clinging to inaccuracies, it asks what the evidence actually shows. It doesn't strip away meaning. It replaces false certainty with a more nuanced understanding. Archaeology, anthropology, and textual analysis reveal how identities form, how stories evolve, and how cultures build cohesion. That kind of insight may not give us miracles, but it gives us truth. And truth, even when it's less dramatic, carries its own dignity. It also allows us to appreciate Exodus in a different light, not as failed history, but as a powerful myth. Seen this way, its inaccuracies stop being embarrassing flaws and become windows into the human mind. They show how people use stories to survive oppression, to build community, to frame hope. That meaning doesn't vanish when the miracles are exposed as fictions. It simply shifts. The danger is when people insist that meaning requires factual accuracy. That position forces them into denial, into rejecting overwhelming evidence. It places faith in conflict with reality. But once we accept that myths can carry meaning without being factual, we are freed from that trap. We can study Exodus critically while still understanding why it mattered to those who told it. The irony is that the truth behind the myth is arguably more inspiring, because the real story of human history is not seas parting on command or plagues striking with perfect timing. It is ordinary people with limited resources carving out identities in a harsh landscape. It is farmers choosing solidarity, herders defining boundaries, and storytellers weaving meaning out of struggle. That is the actual miracle, the human capacity to create belonging without divine intervention. And when we face the inaccuracies honestly, we gain more than historical clarity. We gain a model for how to live with stories responsibly, appreciating them without being ruled by them, respecting their symbolic power without surrendering to their distortions. In modern times, Exodus has been retold again and again, often in contexts far removed. From the ancient world for enslaved people in the Americas, the story of liberation from Egypt became a powerful metaphor for their own struggle. Songs, sermons, and speeches invoked Moses leading his people to freedom. The historical inaccuracies didn't matter. The emotional truth resonated. On the other hand, political leaders and nation builders have used Exodus as a literal charter for their own projects. Colonists in North America described themselves as a new Israel escaping oppression and entering a promised land. The parallels were powerful, but they came at a cost. Native peoples were cast as new Canaanites to be displaced. A story with no archaeological basis became justification for conquest. Nationalist movements in the modern Middle East have also drawn on Exodus. The claim of a divine promise rooted in the story still fuels disputes over land and identity. The inaccuracies, once embedded in Scripture, hardened into political claims. And because myths carry emotional weight, challenging them with archaeology rarely changes minds. This raises the question, why do inaccuracies persist so stubbornly? The answer lies partly in psychology. Myths like Exodus fulfill deep human needs: the need to see suffering as meaningful, the need to believe that justice is possible, the need to belong to a chosen group. These needs are stronger than the desire for factual precision, and so the story survives, even when every spade of the archaeologist's shovel contradicts it. But there's also the power of ritual. Exodus isn't just a story that people read once. It is retold at festivals, acted out in rituals, woven into the rhythm of life. Every year, households gather to repeat the tale as if they themselves had lived it. That act of ritual repetition blurs the line between past and present. In that sense, the historical inaccuracies are irrelevant. The story becomes lived experience. Still, there is a cost. When myths like Exodus are mistaken for history, they shape education, politics, and identity in ways that distort reality. They can be used to justify exclusion, to sanctify violence, or to claim eternal rights to land. The story's power is undeniable, but so is its danger when uncritically accepted. Modern scholarship has worked to separate myth from history. Archaeologists, linguists, and historians have pieced together a picture of the ancient world that makes Exodus unnecessary. Instead of a mass escape from Egypt, we see the slow rise of a new cultural identity within Canaan itself. Instead of a single dramatic event, we see centuries of adaptation and transformation. The real story is not one of sudden miracles, but of gradual change. Yet the myth endures precisely because it offers more drama, more clarity, more emotional payoff, and this exposes something about human nature. We are not only seekers of truth, we are also seekers of a meaning, and when the two come into conflict, meaning often wins. The task, then, is not to strip stories of their meaning, but to keep their meaning from masquerading as fact. Exodus can be appreciated as myth without being treated as history, but making that distinction requires intellectual honesty and courage, qualities not always rewarded in societies built on sacred narratives. One of the more subtle points that often gets overlooked is that Exodus may not be entirely disconnected from reality. Egyptian records do mention groups of Semitic workers living in the Delta region. They were not slaves in the sense the biblical story describes, but more like laborers or indentured servants who had migrated into Egypt during times of famine. These groups sometimes faced harsh conditions, and occasionally they rebelled or fled. It's possible that some of these episodes, involving small numbers of people, became the seeds of memory. A small exodus forgotten in Egyptian history could have been remembered among certain groups and passed down orally. Over time, those memories were woven together, expanded, and elevated into the sweeping drama we now know. In this way, the inaccuracy of the story may not mean it was invented from nothing, but rather that it was magnified beyond recognition. This is a common feature of cultural memory. Small events grow in the telling. Details shift to make the story more powerful. The past becomes less about what actually happened and more about what people need to believe happened. Exodus fits that pattern perfectly, but this also shows the danger of taking the story at face value. If a small episode of laborers leaving Egypt was expanded into hundreds of thousands, then treating the myth as literal history distorts both scales, the scale of human suffering and the scale of cultural identity. What might once have been a local event became universalized into the central drama of a people. We see the same process happening in modern times. Wars, revolutions, and social movements are retold in ways that highlight miracles, exaggerate numbers, and transform leaders into legends. Over time, the line between history and myth blurs until they are inseparable. Exodus is just one of the oldest and most successful examples of this phenomenon. The Egyptian evidence itself tells a quieter story. Inscriptions and papyri describe foreign laborers, but not in terms of grand oppression and miraculous escape. They appear as part of the everyday functioning of the state. And when plagues did occur, droughts, floods, disease, they were treated as natural disasters, not cosmic battles. That contrast between mundane records and dramatic myth highlights just how far Exodus departs from historical reality. Even so, the myth endured because it answered questions that facts could not. Why are we here? How did we become a people? What binds us together? Archaeology can tell us how pottery changed and where settlements grew, but it cannot supply purpose. Stories like Exodus do, and that is why inaccuracies are not mistakes to the communities who hold them, but essential features of a narrative that gives life meaning. The problem arises when that need for meaning overrides the search for truth. Because when myths become unquestionable, they can freeze societies in patterns of thought that resist evidence. And the longer an inaccurate story is repeated, the harder it becomes to separate fact from fiction. This is not unique to Exodus. It is a universal feature of human culture, but the scale and influence of Exodus make it a particularly revealing case. A small thread of memory, perhaps rooted in a minor event, was spun into one of the most enduring myths in history, and in the process it became almost impossible to challenge, no matter how much evidence accumulates against it. The inaccuracies in Exodus aren't just ancient problems. They still echo in modern debates about history, identity, and belief. For some, the story is treated as non-negotiable truth, a foundation on which entire systems of thought and politics are built. To question it is seen as threatening not only the past, but the meaning of the present. This tension can be seen in education. In some classrooms, Exodus is still presented as literal history, despite overwhelming archaeological evidence to the contrary. That approach shields students from the tools of critical inquiry, teaching them to accept rather than to question. It substitutes tradition for evidence, leaving them unprepared for a world where skepticism and analysis are essential. In politics, the story has been invoked as justification for territorial claims. The idea of a promised land tied to a divine covenant still influences real-world disputes. But when that claim is built on a narrative without historical grounding, it turns myth into weapon. The cost of ignoring the inaccuracies isn't abstract. It plays out in lives and conflicts across generations, and on a personal level, the story shapes identity. To believe that your ancestors were liberated by direct divine intervention is to carry a sense of being chosen, of being uniquely guided. But when archaeology contradicts that narrative, the result can be disillusionment. Some cling tighter to the myth, rejecting evidence. Others find freedom in letting go, discovering that meaning does not depend on miracles or plagues, but on the choices we make now. This is where confronting the inaccuracies can be liberating, because it allows people to build identity on truth rather than on myth. Instead of being tied to a story that collapses under scrutiny, they can draw meaning from the real resilience of human history. The farmers in the highlands, the herders carving out a living, the slow shaping of culture over centuries, these are not miracles, but they are real. And there's dignity in that reality. Facing the truth also opens the door to greater empathy. Myths like Exodus divide the world into chosen and rejected, but history shows us that all peoples struggled, all adapted, all sought meaning. No group was uniquely chosen above the rest. That recognition doesn't diminish human value. It expands it. It levels the ground, reminding us that identity is something we create together, not something handed down in stone tablets from the sky. There's also a deeper lesson. Myths can inspire, but they can also trap. By insisting on literal belief in an inaccurate story, communities limit themselves. They close off the possibility of growth, of learning, of adapting. By contrast, acknowledging the inaccuracies is a step toward intellectual maturity. It is choosing to live with complexity rather than clinging to simple illusions. And that choice matters now more than ever, because the world we face today is not one of wandering in deserts or battling pharaohs. It is one of science, technology, and global interconnection. To carry forward myths as literal truth in such a world is to drag the weight of fiction into the realm of fact. That burden distorts our ability to see reality clearly, but to face the inaccuracies honestly is to free ourselves. It is to recognize that meaning does not depend on false history. It is to find dignity not in being chosen by divine decree, but in being human, shaping our own future with open eyes. The authority of Exodus does not come from evidence. It comes from repetition. Year after year, century after century, the story has been told and retold until it has become almost inseparable from identity itself. Families recite it, rituals reenact it, art depicts it, and songs celebrate it. Each retelling reinforces the sense that this is not just a story, but the story. This is how inaccuracies survive, not because they withstand scrutiny, but because they are shielded from it. The act of repeating the story in sacred settings creates an atmosphere where questioning feels like betrayal. Belief becomes less about whether the story is true and more about loyalty to the community. That dynamic ensures that the inaccuracies remain hidden in plain sight. Education plays a critical role here. Where schools present Exodus as literal history, the cycle is reinforced. Where they teach it as myth alongside archaeological evidence, the cycle begins to weaken. The difference is not small, because once a person learns to distinguish between myth and history, they can carry that skill into other areas of life. They become less vulnerable to manipulation, less likely to accept comforting falsehoods at face value. But breaking the cycle takes courage. For many, the story is tied not just to belief, but to family, culture, and belonging. Questioning it can feel like questioning one's place in the world, and that fear keeps many from even entertaining the possibility that Exodus is not history. It is easier to preserve the comfort of myth than to face the discomfort of evidence. And yet, history shows that societies do evolve. Myths, once treated as sacred fact, often shift into symbolic status. The stories of the gods of Greece and Rome were once held with absolute conviction, yet today they are studied as myth. The same is possible with Exodus, but it will require a cultural willingness to accept that inaccuracies once exposed cannot remain the foundation of truth. The repetition that once gave Exodus its authority can also be turned toward honesty. If evidence-based history is taught, retold, and reinforced, it too can gain authority. The question is whether societies are willing to let go of myth as fact and embrace truth as enough. What makes this difficult is that truth often feels less satisfying than myth. A slow cultural transformation in Canaan lacks the drama of seas parting. A story of farmers and herders shaping identity lacks the grandeur of divine miracles. But what truth offers instead is credibility. It stands up to scrutiny. It does not collapse when questioned. And in a world where misinformation spreads so easily, credibility is more valuable than ever. This is why breaking the cycle matters. If we allow inaccuracies to keep passing as fact simply because they are comforting, we weaken our ability to face other truths. We make ourselves more open to manipulation. But if we practice facing myths honestly, beginning with stories like Exodus, we strengthen our resilience. We learn to choose evidence over tradition when the two conflict. That choice doesn't erase meaning. It reshapes it. The meaning of Exodus can still inspire, but only when acknowledged as myth, not mistaken for history. And the real history of the ancient world, complex, gradual, and deeply human, can then be appreciated in its own right. When we move from broad patterns to the finer details, the case against Exodus as history becomes even clearer. The timeline it presents simply doesn't fit what we know from archaeology and ancient records. Take the store cities, said to have been built by the Israelites, Pithom and Pi-Ramesses. The problem is that Pi-Ramesses wasn't built until centuries after the supposed time of the Exodus. If the story were recording an actual memory, it couldn't place Israelite labor in a city that didn't exist yet. This kind of anachronism suggests the story was written much later, by authors looking backward with imperfect knowledge of the past. The route of the Exodus poses another problem, and the text describes travel through places that don't match the geography of the Sinai Peninsula in the late Bronze Age. Scholars have searched for evidence of encampments, pottery, tools, graves, but none has been found. A group of even a few thousand people traveling through the desert for decades would leave clear traces, and the silence is overwhelming. Then there's the Pharaoh. Exodus never names him, which is odd, considering the story's emphasis on confrontation. Later tradition tried to identify him as Ramses II, one of Egypt's most famous rulers, but Ramses' reign is among the best documented in history. We have inscriptions, monuments, and diplomatic letters from his time. None of them mention plagues, mass escapes, or a drowned army. Instead, they show a powerful Egypt projecting strength and stability. Textual studies of Exodus also show signs of multiple layers of authorship. Different sections reflect different styles and concerns, suggesting that the book was compiled from various sources over time. This explains some of the inconsistencies, but it also means that the story is not the record of a single event, but a patchwork narrative woven together for theological and political purposes. Even the famous crossing of the Red Sea falters under scrutiny. The Hebrew phrase may originally have referred to the Sea of Reeds, a marshy area near the Nile Delta. Later translations turned it into the Red Sea, making the miracle far more dramatic. But even if we take the more modest interpretation, there is no evidence of such an event. No drowned armies, no abandoned weapons, no sudden disappearance of Egyptian control in the region. Archaeological surveys of Canaan during the period also show continuity rather than disruption. If hundreds of thousands of newcomers had arrived, we would expect dramatic changes in settlement patterns. Instead, what we see is a slow expansion of small highland villages that appear culturally continuous with their neighbors. The pottery, architecture, and diet all point to a local origin rather than an invasion or mass migration. The more closely we examine the details, the less they fit. And this is why most historians, including many who are religious, do not treat Exodus as literal history. They see it as myth, perhaps inspired by fragments of memory, but not grounded in the events it claims to describe. The irony is that the inaccuracies are not random mistakes. They reveal the perspective of the storytellers. By inserting later cities into earlier times, they were anchoring the story in places familiar to their audience. By dramatizing natural disasters into plagues, they were making the story more compelling. By keeping the pharaoh nameless, they avoided contradicting known history. The inaccuracies are fingerprints of authors crafting a story, not witnesses recording events. And once those details were locked into scripture, they gained a weight far beyond their accuracy. What began as literary devices became treated as literal history, and for centuries those inaccuracies were passed on as fact, shaping how entire cultures understood their past. When we set the Exodus aside and turn to the evidence, a very different story of Israel's origins emerges. Instead of a mass departure from Egypt, what archaeology shows is a slow, local development within the land of Canaan itself. Excavations in the highlands of Canaan reveal the earliest Israelite settlements. Small villages began appearing around the late 13th and 12th centuries BCE. They were modest, built with simple houses clustered around courtyards. The pottery found in these sites is nearly identical to that of their Canaanite neighbors, suggesting continuity rather than a foreign intrusion. The key difference is subtle. In these highland villages, archaeologists find almost no pig bones, while pigs were commonly eaten in surrounding cultures. That absence suggests that these groups were beginning to define themselves in contrast to their neighbors. Avoiding certain foods became a marker of identity. In this way, Israelite culture grew not from migration but from boundary making within a shared landscape. There's also evidence that many of these early settlements were established by people moving upward from the lowlands, perhaps seeking independence from the larger city-states that dominated the valleys. If so, the Israelites were not outsiders arriving from Egypt, but locals breaking away from the older Canaanite system. They were redefining themselves socially, politically, and religiously. Texts like Exodus may have crystallized centuries later when these groups looked back and sought to explain their distinctiveness. Instead of remembering themselves as Canaanites who set new boundaries, they remembered themselves as outsiders who had always been different. That memory was more powerful, more inspiring, and more unifying, but it was not accurate. This model, known as the emergent Israel theory, is supported by the evidence on the ground. The distribution of settlements, the continuity of material culture, and the gradual development of distinct practices all point to Israel arising from within Canaan. No sudden invasion, no mass migration, no dramatic escape from Egypt. Even the earliest external reference to Israel, the Merneptah Stele, an Egyptian inscription from the late 13th century BCE, places Israel already in Canaan. The text celebrates Pharaoh Merneptah's victory over various groups in the region and mentions Israel among them. This shows that a people calling themselves Israel already existed in the land before any supposed exodus could have taken place. This real history is less dramatic than the biblical story, but in some ways it is more profound because it shows how identity is not given from above or forged in a single miraculous event. It is built slowly through ordinary choices, through cultural boundaries, through shared struggle. The Israelites were not created in a moment of liberation. They were shaped over generations like every other people in history. Understanding this doesn't diminish their story, it enriches it. It grounds it in the reality of human resilience and creativity rather than in a myth detached from evidence. It shows us that identity doesn't require miracles to be meaningful. It requires human effort, imagination, and endurance. And in a sense, this real story is more universal because it reminds us that all peoples emerge this way, not through divine interventions, but through the messy, gradual process of history. That recognition can foster humility, empathy, and a deeper appreciation for the shared human experience.